Well, hey, thanks for having me here to talk today. I want to go over what over the years I've tried to reduce down to a very simple concept that I think is very powerful for the way that people should be doing infrastructure management, operations management, whatever you call it in your organization. Oftentimes, when it comes to people who are in charge of your VMware, vSphere, your virtualization estate, your VI admin. But as things have been changing, your headwinds, your digital transformation, the need to do software better, all of that stuff. The role that custom written in-house software plays changes dramatically. The software you use to order groceries, the software you use that you write on your own to manage your supply chain, the software you might use for your online banking, the software you might use to give out emergency loans that people have needed over the past year, all sorts of things like that. There's also interesting examples of there's a car manufacturer I've heard of who has an app that collects together they call it a CV, but it collects together the history of a vehicle that you've owned. And I just want to go over this one because it's a fascinating example of why we care about all this digital transformation stuff, in the sense that what's interesting about that is it, uses all the trillions of data of data that we always hear about. And then also the idea of computers, cars being rolling computers. But you have this very simple kind of almost quotidian thing of, here is the dossier of this car's history. And what you can use it for when you're selling that car is to prove the truthfulness of the good shape of that car, right? Like, you think about selling cars between, used cars to people, and it's largely based on distrust, right? That, am I getting a lemon, a bad car? And how would I even know if this is a good car if it's been in a wreck, that they've taken care of it? But if you generate this kind of proof that the car has been taken care of and what it's been going on, it's an interesting way of solving that annoying thing of negotiating prices. And you inject this amount of trust, this trusted record of a car. And I think it helps both sides. The buyer knows that they're getting a better car, and the seller can sell it for a lot more. It increases the value of that car rather than having to kind of discount it for the unknownness of it. So there's all those examples of why it's better to be good at software in your business, right? And I think what I want to focus on here is, we hear a lot about what the developers need to do. They need to be more product oriented. But I think equally important, and especially critical at the beginning, is to make sure that the infrastructure people, the operations people, also change how they're thinking about the way they do infrastructure to match the needs of those development teams working on all those kinds of interesting software things. And I'll get to this concept. It's a shift in thinking to think about the platform you're providing as a product, rather than a set of services or a deliverable, or however you may be thinking about it. Now, just briefly, this is me. Everyone calls me Cote. I've spent many of the past years basically studying how large organizations, doing what I was just going over, get better at software, how they start to use software as the way they do innovation for their business, not just kind of deliver software that they're doing and kind of even hone their own internal facing things, but how they really match it up to the way the organization functions, whether it's a commercial enterprise or a government, and change how they're doing things. So if you've ever had discussions about, like, how do we start doing DevOps? How do we be more product oriented? How do we compete? And how do we be a tech company? How do we become one of those organizations that love to say, we're not an XYZ company. We're actually a software company that just happens to sell XYZ. That's the kind of thinking and transformation I like to study. And there's a couple of these books that I've written over the years. I'm always working on a new one that you can get for free. But if you just go to cote.io, you can check out that. And I do a couple of podcasts. Feel free to dig in more if you're interested in this type of content and those kind of studies. I always appreciate the engagement with my brand. Let's first kind of set up a model of how I think people how I see organizations that are successfully transforming the way they think about how they use IT, transforming how they think about their own software as a way to innovate and run their business, to be successful at whatever goals they have. And that is a lot of what's going on in the application development cycle. The cycle of using software to run your business is shifting from a project way of doing software. And by project way, I mean, here's a set of requirements that we have: screens, features, user stories, personas, user would like to this and that. And as a development team, you deliver those features to someone, right? Like, you implement them out, you deliver them, you're done, right? Now, of course, you keep working on it and troubleshooting, but you kind of just take what you're asked to do and you deliver to that. Now, the opposite of that is, as we'll get into, is people are thinking more and more about a product way. In the same way that a business would think about the product that it has, it's constantly trying to think about what problem are we solving, what people are we selling to, what's the market, how do we compete. You're always evolving or innovating that business, right? And that's why I keep saying innovation, because it just means studying and adapting to what people want to do. Now, to do software in that kind of way, it becomes very important, depending on what you have up. Everyone always thinks that they're an exception and their stuff is very important. And sometimes it is, if you're dealing with, like, missiles or something like that. But generally, organizations I see who think about using software in a product-oriented way, they focus on delivering their software on a weekly basis, if not more frequently. And what they're doing is, because of that frequency, they are able to kind of explore and innovate with code. They're able to study and react to what users are doing more. Now, to support that weekly deployment, what people end up doing, what they focus a tremendous amount on, and especially if you're in the infrastructure area, think about what it takes just to deploy one line of code, right? Like, it usually takes much more than a week to get that line of code, verify that it's good, make sure the developers have built it, go through all the auditing that you have, and actually deploy it down, have all the meetings you need to have, right? And so that's the first thing, the critical thing that the world of DevOps has been trying to solve over the years, is how do we speed up the deployment process so that it still works, right? No one's suggesting that you deploy garbage to production, right? How do we make sure that this pipeline that we have has as little waste, as little delay in as possible, that allows our developers, and if you think about it, the business, once those two of them fit together well, that allow us to get new features into production rapidly, right? And usually what developers find, what organizations find, is that this value chain, if you want to call it that, but this pipeline has a lot of work that needs to go into it to remove delay and remove waste from the system. And, there's I think it's interesting to see what perceptions are at the executive layer, the developer layer, about what needs to be addressed. But this is the main thing that infrastructure people probably in past years, this year, and years in the future need to figure out, is accelerating that pipeline. Now, the first step is kind of analyzing all the steps that you do. Again, just think about deploying one line of code. Think about deploying even your existing code to production, right? What are all the steps you would need to go through? And really honing and perfecting that is the first stage that infrastructure people are getting to when they want to support this product-driven way of thinking about software. Now, it's kind of ridiculous. Like, we've always focused on automating and speeding up deployment, right? A lot of focus, as we've gotten into now, when it comes to that pipeline of writing your code and getting it securely and reliably running in production, also comes down to those last two things, like security and reliability, right? Like, how do we remove human error, not only delay and speed things up? And way back when I was still a programmer, right? Like, there were a whole bunch of automation frameworks, like Blade Logic, Opsware, all sorts of things like that. I love this poster. It represents everything about early 2000s software development. Super awesome, that robot person and the floating icons. But even back then, we were trying to reduce down that pipeline, right? And, I was writing a lot of the code for it and a firsthand witness to this. A lot of what we got bogged down to is really focusing too much on that pipeline and too much reliance on it and too much of our own process. And I see this all the time even now, is that it's a very, again, project mentality where you're thinking about in IT and the ops infrastructure area, I'm delivering a set of services. We have specified ahead of time what the availability of those services are, what quotas you have, what the costs are, what the response times to tickets are. And really what we're delivering is, this is kind of a meta layer, we're delivering a service, right? Whatever that service does isn't really what our job is. Our job is to meet that criteria that we had delivered. And if that service is useful or not, it's not really our concern. It was originally, when we came up with all this IT service management and ITEL things. But people kind of revert down to what they're measured by. And what you get measured by, again, are those basics of the service, right? And especially evolving it, changing that service and modifying it is a whole other set of difficulty. Now, over the years, and DevOps is largely a reaction to this, right? That we need to evolve the software that we have at a rapid clip. So we also need to evolve the way that we do operations to constantly be improving and getting better, and not just sort of representing that it's doing a good job, that all of its metrics are green. And so we had DevOps come in and, true to its name, kind of fold in not only operations into development, but to make developers kind of go back into the operations area and more think about infrastructure as part of their application, which is a great step. And where we are now is a lot of that has been codified after a lot of squabbling out in the industry over the past 5 or 6 years about what the standard would be. But the standard for how new software and increasingly modernized software is run, and even how it's architected, is based on essentially container-driven development, or, Kubernetes is the technology that's used nowadays. And what that is to very much so simplify it, it's a platform, it's a runtime layer for running containerized applications, basically distributed applications that are put into containers and that coordinate with each other over the network, hence the distributed application part. Now, we used to call that an SOA. It had its own type way of doing things. Enterprise service buses fit into there. But nowadays, we're kind of reinventing this idea of how distributed applications, the different modules, work with each other over things called service meshes. I mean, similar principles apply, but it's a new set of technologies. So this is a huge shift of that infrastructure layer that definitely we see at VMware and we've been working on for quite some time, is we have now this platform, right? So what does it mean, instead of managing an automation set of services, even kind of a static, more pre-cloud cloud, if you will? How does operations infrastructure, VI admins, change what they do? Well, let's get right into it. And again, I think the focus needs to be purely on how are we satisfying that need of our organization to deliver custom software well, right? Like, how do we evolve the platform that we have to match the evolving needs of those developers, right? Those examples of applications that I was going up earlier. Now, this loop, right? Like a lot of what I've been talking about is evolving and changing what the nature of those services are, rather than deploying to a static set of requirements and needs, right? And this small batch loop, this way of innovating and discovering the new things you need to do, is also done by the developers. And essentially what it says, and you'll hear people talk about learning organizations a lot and things like that, is it brings back this notion of a learning organization, of constant discovery, of lean product management. I'm just kind of throwing out all these words in case you know what they are. Back to the operations area, where your operations people, when they're building this platform and when they're extending that platform, they're not only running it, but they're constantly coming up with a hypothesis, a theory of what's new functionality that we could add to this platform that will make our customers' jobs better, right? So in the same way that the application developers are thinking about what are new features that we can add to our applications to make our customers, the customer of the organization or your internal users of internal facing software, how do we change the features in the software? How do we move pixels on the screens to make it better? The infrastructure people now are thinking about those development teams as their customers, and they're constantly trying out and studying new things and thinking about how do we make our customers, the developers, successful? Now, obviously, the number one story and requirement of all of these people is the stuff should work, right? Like, if you're kind of reacting to this and thinking like, oh, that means it's not going to work, there's a problem in what's going on there, right? So, a lot of what we do in the industry is we're trying to constantly figure out the best type of platform, the best software, and kind of learning from things that work and don't work, and put that into our Kubernetes distro, kind of the advice that we give out. So people using this, obviously you need to rely on tools and practices that are good. But the concept that I want to focus on is not so much that day-to-day thing, but this mentality of we are going to run our platform as a product and reorient the way that we think and the way that we specify what our job is, not just delivering a service. So when you're doing this, the key thing is, again, as you might think, so we need to put, again, at the moment, a Kubernetes platform in place. We need to have the middleware that the developers use, the set of services, the databases, the event queues, whatever. And we also need to have that pipeline. So we deliver that build pipeline to them, right? That's part of the infrastructure that you're delivering, that you even collaborate with developers on. And as you look at this more and more, a lot of the security and the reliability, the traditional things that operations people do to make the infrastructure work, to do their core job, is done by having that good build pipeline, right? That way of taking the code that the developers have, making sure it's built and containerized, making sure that you have all the right configuration that you have, automating a lot of the release management to get it in production, and also making sure that it's been instrumented along the way, that you have the right hooks in the code, the right APIs that allow you to monitor and manage it in production, and then to go do that cycle over again, right? So again, even what I'm going over, you can see that as an infrastructure people, you're no longer only in charge of just, running your vSphere install, right? Of keeping it up and running, of collecting what the new storage requirements are, kind of like building this raw infrastructure. You have this almost passion, this product management mindset of studying what it is the developers need and trying to improve what their jobs are, right? So that's why you start to think more and more about the build pipeline in addition to the infrastructure that you're providing. Because it's not really up to developers with using the build pipeline thing. Like, that's not really what they're delivering, right? They're delivering moving pixels on the screen, so that build pipeline becomes part of the platform that you have, right? The way that they containerize their applications and run it in Kubernetes is not really moving pixels on the screen. That's part of the infrastructure you're providing. The way that all the components in their applications communicate with each other over the network becomes part of, again, not how they move pixels on the screen. That becomes part of the platform that you are providing, right? So all of this you can see goes up and up the stack from raw infrastructure. But more importantly, as you study and work with these developers, you learn how to evolve the platform for the needs they have. And it's going to be specific to each organization that you're in, right? The needs that one large bank has will look kind of similar to the needs that another large bank has, but the back-end processing systems that they have, the existing ERP systems that they work on to do customer retrieval, the data privacy concerns that they have, how they deal with regional banks across the world and integrate across many different markets or countries that they have. These needs tend to be somewhat unique technologically, and again, they become features of that platform that you're providing. Another phrase people like to use is enterprise architecture. So what you're going to do, and I see this over and over again, so I feel pretty confident being prescriptive about it, is you're going to build a product team that's building that product as a platform, and you're going to start to be applying this notion of how do we think about developers as our customers and really product manage the infrastructure that we're doing, not just specify and write up a bunch of SLAs, but we are delivering a product to the customers. And you'll find a lot of success if you take this approach rather than just dumping a cloud out to them, rather than just kind of setting up a Kubernetes instance or an internal cloud and just assuming that because you deliver this and mandate that this is the infrastructure that they use. Like, people don't really do that. We call this, from that old movie Field of Dreams, the build it and they will come fallacy. And this happens over and over again, that without really product managing what customers are doing, you kind of miss out on delivering what they actually need rather than what you specified. So let me go over, so getting that mentality in place, right? I want to go over just a few common hurdles or tactics that people encounter, right? And this is really the types of things that I get most interested in encountering, right? Because it's easy, as I've done, to go over like, all right, so instead of delivering services, your kind of internal cloud, your whatever you want to call it, your big chunk of virtualized infrastructure and networking and storage, and just kind of like providing a grocery store of infrastructure to people, to your developers. Instead, you need to product manage it and work with them and kind of study what it is they need and always be evolving that infrastructure to fit their needs. It sounds wonderful, right? But getting that in place in an existing organization is very difficult for most places. And hopefully you can learn from what other people have struggled through. And I'll just go over a few of those. And there's always some more. And I'm always very curious to hear what problems you're having, other people are having. And also, I mean, if you've got a solution, that's also nice to hear. But really understanding what issues people have as they do this, I think is helpful for all of us to have and to share. So first, and this is advice that applies also to the application developers and to IT as a whole. What I really notice is that many organizations for various reasons. A lot of them having to do with kind of urgency, a little bit of bravado, but also kind of making the business case, right? That if we're of doing big transformation, they want to do everything at once. They want to do big bang transformation, right? We're just going to switch over everything in the first year. But this really doesn't work very well, right? Sometimes it works. Like we have a customer back in the States, Comcast, that seems like they've done a pretty big switch over all at once. But in general, it doesn't work out very well. And instead, what I see organizations doing, not only at the application layer, but at the infrastructure layer, right? And also at the managerial layer, as I talk about when I go over cultural things, is instead what they focus on is they focus on starting small, right? So they pick literally one project, maybe 2 or 3 projects, and they have that platform in place, right? And in our instance, they have the Tanzu stack in place, a Kubernetes stack in place with the various types of middleware and thinking about that build pipeline and the practices that they use, this platform as a product approach and the product management approach that they have on the development teams. And they pick a project and they start with that, right? Just one project. Now, this project needs to be, to use some more jargon, business facing, right? So it shouldn't just be like a conference room scheduling app or something like that. It needs to be something that actually is used by the business. Again, internally facing or externally facing. I find initial projects like this are often things like bill presentment, even a store finder app or an ATM finder app. There's an example from the Home Depot where the software used for the custom paint mixing, you go in and you want to match some paint to some other color. The software they use to run that, they use that. But you start with a small project like this, and what's important is that you learn from what you're doing, right? You're not going to get everything right the first time. The developers, the infrastructure people, management especially, right, is going to need to learn how to do things in this new way. They're going to need to try one method of delivering things, right? Do we deliver every week or every 2 weeks? Do we make people use a build pipeline, or do we allow them to customize it? What programming language is good? What approach to doing this is good? How do we set SLAs or service level objectives if you want to be all Google site reliability engineering? I realize those two aren't the same thing, but what kind of working relationship do we have between all the layers? How do we organize the teams? You're going to have to discover a lot of that on your own. There's some general patterns, but let's use the 80-20%, that 20% that's specialized to you, you're going to have to learn from it, right? And it's better to have a small amount of projects that you learn from than one large one. Now, the important part also of starting small is that as you build up a success with these small teams, you have people, developers, infrastructure people, managers, and as you get more and more projects, as you kind of see with this curve that's going up, you take select people who generally are people. They know how to talk with people and they're outgoing. They kind of can communicate. You take some of them and you seed them into the new teams, right? So you're spreading that knowledge into new teams so that each new team doesn't have to learn from scratch. And you know how that spread works, of either people talking about the shampoo that they use in the 80s or more of a exponential spread of things. As you build up more and more people on those teams, you have more and more people to seed, and you can spread out to more and more teams and grow out, right? So the key thing there is that kind of bottoms up, I wouldn't call it bottoms up necessarily because it's managed by executives, but that seeded way of growing. And indeed, if you look in the recent DevOps reports, when they've studied successful scaling up large-scale change, that seeding approach also works really well. So that's something that we see over and over again, that I've seen in our larger customers, is they really follow that approach of getting a couple of knowledgeable people, starting with small projects. Once you have success with that project, start more and seed people out there. And this same thing happens with the way that you're thinking about doing platform work, right? That the teams that you set up will be the initial ones working on these initial projects, and they'll be understanding how to do that platform as a product, how to run things in a new way. And the important thing is to take those learnings and fold it back into there. Now, that brings us to the next thing that's important. If you think about it just a little bit, as you're adding more and more developers using this new platform, right? This Kubernetes substrate with all the middleware and service mesh stuff on top of it, the build pipeline that you'll be using, you infrastructure people and the platform team, again, it's been shown over the past years of large organizations I've talked with, that you're going to be doing a lot of consulting, a lot more consulting than even you realize me saying that. So I see this in places like BT, Duke Energy, all sorts of organizations that are doing this, is they actually have to budget a couple of people, at least for the first year, if not more people, to just go out and work with those developer teams, to consult with them, to be embedded on those teams for a few releases, maybe a month or two, to explain to them not only how to use the platform, how to use the build pipeline, but it's also a great way to learn about your customer and evolve that. So definitely budget out for that you're going to be doing consulting, not just sort of telling people how the service should work in the old sort of everyone's favorite RTFM way of educating the users of your infrastructure. Now, the other side of this, and this applies to the organization as a whole, but a lot of the times, like for example with BT, I see the infrastructure people leading this, is every quarter you're going to want to have an internal conference. Nowadays, when things are online, you can kind of get away with a half-day conference. When people get back to being face-to-face, it's good for it to be a day-long conference where you bring in people, and you can do this regionally. You can move around, or if you're more centralized, you can have it in a more centralized place. But every quarter, you want to have an internal conference where you're basically educating people about this new platform you have, this new way of operating, and you have those existing small teams, right, that you started with. They start to present their experience, right? And this internal conference, it's not only training, right, which is what you need to get people to understand how to use the platform, but it's two other things. It's also marketing, really, something that I don't think a lot of infrastructure people would think about, but you do have to market people's interest in using that platform, draw them into it and get them passionate and interested about using it. But it's also that third thing, the product part, where you're directly engaging with your customers and your prospects, if you will, the development teams and even enterprise architects and auditors that you want to operate in this new way. And it's a good chance for you to meet them and talk with them and see what their requirements are to start working with them more and more, right? So again, a lot of what we're talking about here is, and I'm, exaggerating when I say things like this, is no longer working with your customers, with people through ticket desks and change review board meetings, kind of through process, but working with them in the same way that a product-driven company, tech companies, work with their customers, is really understanding and interacting with them and understanding what their needs are. And that is what I think it really means to think about as a platform, as a product, and obviously evolve the platform to based on those insights that you have. Let me just close out with one other thing, right? And I think that is that when you're doing things this way, you still need to collect metrics, right? So there's all the performance metrics, obviously, and these words change over time, but that it works, whether that's availability, mean time to repair, uptime can be good or can be like not accurate, but is the raw infrastructure you're providing, does it work, right? Like people may debate about should we talk about uptime anymore, but we certainly talk about downtime when that occurs, right? So a lot of the focus is on more like mean time to repair and resilience. But, there's all those technical metrics that are worth looking into. But you also need to start tracking, let's call them outcome metrics, right? What are the metrics that we have that are indicating that our efforts, our transformation is working, right? How many people are moving over to the platform? What are the product teams, the developers team's satisfaction with the platform? By using this platform, are they actually moving their applications to production, right? So you want to monitor the usefulness of what you're doing, not just, again, as I was saying at the beginning, that you are delivering it successful, right? Even if all your dashboard is green and no one is using your platform or getting any value from it, even if you've done perfectly and the dashboard is green, you're not really successful at it. So as there's a great talk from TD Ameritrade about how they were monitoring the rollout and measuring the rollout of this that I would really recommend looking into, if not using the metrics that they did to measure how the team was functioning, to start to get in your mind how you would come up with those metrics. So with that, there's a longer sort of brain dump that you can find about all of these topics, even more things. I go more in depth about what platform operations and platform as a service looks like. There's a good recording of that. You can see zany me there. And like I mentioned, I discussed this topic and even more topics, the developers and the managerial layer in the two books that I have, and the little videos and overviews, all sorts of content if you're interested in more. If you go to cote.pizza, a real domain name, you can find links to all of those things. And I'm always happy to talk with people. You can reach me through email or through Twitter there. I'm always happy to answer questions, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.